Hello everyone, my name is Joshua Joushi Howard. Today I'm going to be doing something somewhere between Officer Training School and Joushi Rambling to talk about Doombolt Guard. This is something that I've been getting a lot of people asking me about in the comments. People keep hearing that I keep hearing you talk about this Doombolt Guard, but I don't really know what it is and I don't really understand it. So this is that video for you. What is Doombolt Guard? And we're going to be going over basics of how to play it with an example of my deployment and where you can kind of go from there and what makes it so strong. So to start off with, what is Doombolt Guard? Doombolt Guard is an army archetype that Gustavo de Sousa over in the UK developed a relatively early into the life of Grizzled Company, where the entire core idea was that you're going to take all of the Kazarkin and all of the Krieg engineers that you could in order to do a ton of mortal wounds to your opponent. Again, when you throw a melt-a-mine at a vehicle, you can do 2d3 mortals to it. When you throw an engineer remote mine at a vehicle, you can do 2d3 mortals to it. And so the core idea of the list came from I'm going to be doing as much mortal wounds to my opponent. Since then, it has gone on to take on a bit of a larger life of its own. There's a lot of different ways to play Doombolt Guard. There's a lot of different variants of it, but I'm going to be going over the core of it, and I'm going to be going over a couple of different ways that you can tweak it a little bit to your certain tastes. So, what does Doombolt Guard look like now? So we've gone through a couple of patches. We've had a couple of opportunities for Grizzled Company to be nerfed a little bit, to have some of our data sheets go up in points, namely the Rogel Dorns. But this is the core of a modern Doombolt list. This is about 1,400 points of stuff that you basically need in the list in order for it to be considered Doombolt. And then you have about 600 points of things that you can play around with that don't necessarily need to be this core. So, in the core, the main thing that is most important is still 3 units of 10 Kazarkin. They are incredibly efficient skirmishers. They're going to be decent at taking down light vehicles. They are really going to consistently kill like Chaos Spawn or Scout Marines or any of the other things that our opponent is going to be using to put out in the middle of the board relatively cheaply. Kazarkin are going to destroy those, and then they're going to be not difficult, but not trivial to remove for our opponent. Kazarkin are just really, really good. A couple of big things to remember here is their ability Warrior Elite does work after you get out of a transport, and the other major thing that you can do is if your opponent is going first, you get out of a transport, you order yourself to be doing more damage, and then in the next battle round, you can be like, okay, it's a new battle round. I have Warrior Elite active again. I'm going to use this to go ahead and give my Kazarkin 3-up saves, and then they have Space Marine saves, and they are surprisingly difficult to remove, especially when your opponent thinks, oh, those are just normal dudes. They will die to stubbers. I don't need to really pay attention to them. They will quickly find out that that is incorrect. Other major thing that we really need in this is ways to get these Kazarkin where they are going. You really very rarely see Doombolt variants without at least 2 transports. It is most commonly Chimeras, but every now and then you will also see these be Tauroxes. Chimeras are preferred to Tauroxes most of the time because even though Tauroxes can get the Kazarkin to where they want to go faster, the Taurox doesn't do anything else. The Taurox is just going to get you where you're going quickly, and then it's going to die, right? Because it won't be able to do actions. It can stand on objectives a little bit. It can move block a little bit on its own. But the Chimera, moving 10 or 13 inches, you always equip them with 2 heavy flamers. They are going to be skirmishing pieces in their own right. Those 2 heavy flamers and the 18 shots of additional heavy stubber and lasgun array are very easily going to be clearing 10 cultists. You're very consistently going to be killing 10 zanglers. You're going to do pretty decent damage to 10 guardsmen as well, and so that's why they tend to be slightly preferred over Tauroxes in most of the modern Doombolt builds. Other major thing that we need is 1 Rogel Dorn commander. It is very difficult to play Doombolt without at least 1 Rogel Dorn. Many variants choose to take 2, but the 1 Rogel Dorn does a couple of things. One, it keeps your opponent movement honest. If they are trying to move, especially like light vehicles around in open firing lanes, the Dorn says, you're not allowed to do that. You need to respect the firepower that I can bring. The other thing that it is really good at doing is because it has such a large volume of damage 3 attacks, your opponent is going to have to respect the fact that you can do that at long range. It is way easier for a Dorn to pick up 3 Exalted 8-bound or a unit of 5 Chosen than it is for something like Scions or Kazarkin, because the 3 wounds on these infantry does make it a little bit more difficult for Kazarkin or Scions to deal with those, because we just have the wrong profile. We just have the wrong profiles trying to kill them. The other major piece that make something a Doombolt list is the 20 Cadian shock troops. You take them with melted plasma. You attach them to a Cadian command squad, which is most commonly you drop the flag and you take a plasma gun instead. So you have 2 plasma guns, a medic, the Voxcaster or the Master Vox is not optional, and then you have the commander who gives you cover while you're touching an objective. You give them a Cadian Castellan, which gives the entire unit fall back and shoot, and then also gives you sustained, and this is really important for making sure that if this unit gets tagged, it doesn't get turned off. And then the preferred Ogryn bodyguard right now for this brick has been Nork Deadog. For 20 points more than a normal Ogryn bodyguard, you do give up the 4-up invul, so you aren't quite as durable, but it does give you some much needed extra melee punch. Remember that if you get the charge in and Nork does give a headbutt, that's going to be an average of 2 mortal wounds into most things that you're swinging into, which can be the last couple of wounds you need in order to open up a transport, and then Nork can pile in and stab whatever it is that was in that transport with his knife, because the timing is a little bit weird. The other big thing is it makes it harder for an opponent to charge this unit or consolidate into this unit, because sometimes Nork will just be like, are you sure you want to do that? You put 5 JPI into this unit, you then killed a dozen normal Cadians, and then Nork goes stab, stab, stab. You don't want to do this. Also, I have fall back and shoot anyway, so it doesn't do a whole lot. It really helps to protect this brick running around, and you really want, even if you don't choose to go with Nork, you do want an Ogryn bodyguard at least, because this Cadian Castellan is not very durable on his own, and giving him that 4-up Feel No Pain to make sure that the Cadian Castellan is hard to precision out is a really big deal for this list. The last thing that you really need to make something a Doombolt list, and the modern variations of it, is 2 units of Scions. You will have you'll have 2 command squads and 2 units of 5. These are just really, really good in Grizzle Company in general, but the thing that they do in this is they add to the fact that all of this has a 4-up save base. As long as this is touching an objective and you have cover, this kind of has a 4-up save base, and this is even more infantry with a 4-up save that does a lot of damage. 5 Scions with the command squad, when they drop and they have 2 orders for take aim and first rank, second rank fire, because you always give the Tempestor Prime a command rod, are going to kill 7 to 9 just basic Marines that are not on an objective and in cover very, very consistently. Every now and then you'll only kill 6, every now and then you'll kill all 10. But if a unit of 10 Marines is on an objective, or you pop a strat for ignores cover, or you pop a strat for the +1 strength on the lasguns, you very quickly go from killing 7 to 9 to killing all 10 Marines. And this is another big reason why, if you're going to be taking Scions, you don't typically go for the 10 Scions plus a command squad. It's typically why you go for the 5 plus a command squad instead, because while the 10 plus a command squad are going to be killing those Marines in cover, not on an objective, leaving our opponent with 1 Marine is usually not that big of a deal. And spending 70 extra points to make sure we kill that 1 extra Marine is usually not the best spend of 70 points. But if you are looking to play a Doombolt list, this is what you need to include. Again, this is just under 1,400 points, and there are a couple of different ways that you can build this list in order to do a couple of slightly different things. Now, with the last 600 points, you have a number of options. I'm going to be taking you over my variation of the Doombolt list first, and then we'll talk a little bit about some other options that you can take. I really like going with a second Rogel Dorn. A couple of reasons for this. One, I predominantly play on Games Workshop terrain. And Games Workshop terrain has some of the longest firing lanes of any competitive terrain set that is currently being played. And what I've often found is that having only 1 Dorn means it is too easy for my opponent to navigate where my Dorn can get to, and then they can move in disrespectful ways way too easily. Having that second Dorn helps solve that problem. The other major problem that I find the second Dorn helps find is there are a number of armies, like Ultramarines or Tau, which do in fact win long-range shootouts going up against a Dorn. However, a lot of these armies will win the one-on-one shootout with a Repulsor Executioner versus a Dorn. But it's much more difficult for them to want to opt into a 2v1 shootout where we can have both Dorns stand next to each other and shoot down the long firing lane together. And by having the second Dorn, I can discourage a lot of my opponents from peeking some of their pieces out in order to try and shoot at my army. The other part that I really enjoy keeping is this 3x5 Krieg Engineers. This is part of the original Doombolt list as well, and they are very cheap. They are only 60 points for 5 models. They still have the mortal wounds, they still have the ability to throw a grenade for free, and other than that, they contribute to the continued issue of, I have a ton of bodies with 4-up saves, can you remove all of them, and can you remove them efficiently? And a lot of the time, the answer is no. After that, due to the recent nerfs, I had to find some room in order to change a couple of pieces in order to make sure that both Rogaldorns still fit in the list. One of the changes that I made is putting in this Death Core of Krieg unit. This is a downgrade from my Chimera, but it is just 10 bodies that do res D3 guys. And one of the things that I see a lot when people are talking about building Doombolt lists is, why is this Death Core of Krieg and not Catachan? And the reason for that is I already have 6 units that scout in the list. I have 3 units of 5 Krieg Engineers, and I have 3 units of Khazarkin that all scout 6. I don't need more scout. And in fact, my army can't really support more scout. So, having the Death Core of Krieg is probably the most efficient just 10-man battle line that you can just have in your list. The last one that I have is a bit of a personal style choice, that is 10 Cadians. I think if you wanted to sub out these 10 Cadians for 10 more Death Core of Krieg, it's probably actually a stronger list. However, these Cadians are really, really easy to play. They're going to sit in my backfield, and they're going to screen, and I'm not going to move them for like 3 turns. And it means that I don't have to think about what I'm doing with this part of my army. The game plan can stay the same into almost every opponent. However, if you want to turn them into 10 Death Core of Krieg, I think it's probably better. It just means that you have to think a little bit harder about the game, and I hate thinking. Now, is this the only way to play Doombolt? Absolutely not. Another common variant that you see for Doombolt is the medic maxing variant that Gustavo has also recently been pivoting to a little bit. And that version drops 1 Rogaldorn in exchange for 10 Scions, plus a command squad, and then an Ogren bodyguard. And then you trade out the 3 units of Krieg Engineers for 3 units of Death Core of Krieg. This variant doesn't do the same amount of mortal wounds, and it's not quite as fast on the board. However, it makes up for it with the fact that you have a total of 7 medics in your army that are each going to be bringing back D3 guys. And so you're very plausibly bringing back 14 models every one of your command phases. This drastically helps your ability to just push your opponent and create a lot of problems for them. One of the idiosyncrasies of this style of list is you are almost always starting the 10 Scions with a command squad and Nork on the board. This is largely due to the fact that you just need their damage on the board immediately to make sure that your opponent cannot just run you down. Another variant that you sometimes see is what I think of as the extra Scions variant. Most notably, I've seen David Purcell play this route, and I believe also Scott McCutcheon has been playing it a little bit as well. And this version removes some of the extra trap pieces in order to bring an extra unit of Scions in the list. It naturally becomes a more damage-oriented version of the list in order to try and push your opponent as aggressively as you can. The last variant that you sometimes see is what I call the double brick variant. I most recently saw this being played by Tony Baumeier at the California Team Championships, but I know that there are other members of the community that are playing this as well. And this version of the list, in general, is going to be dropping some Scions and some of the extra chaff pieces in order to bring a second Cadian Castellan brick. This version of the list does a little bit less damage, and is a little bit less mobile than a couple other versions of the list. However, it makes up for it by making sure that you have that extra Cadian brick that is very difficult for opponents to remove. But overall, most of these variants of the list are still trying to play the same game plan. So let's start talking about the core theory of the list a little bit more. I'm going to naturally be doing it through the lens of the list that I have been playing, but most of what I'm going to be saying is still true of a lot of the other variants of the list that you can try and play yourself. Doombolt is an army that likes to play in waves. So the first thing that we think about with this army is, what does it do? And one of the major things that it does is it does an unfair number of mortal wounds. Between 3 Melta-Mines, 3 Remote Mines, Nork, and a Grenade, we can very plausibly do 29 mortal wounds in a single turn, with an absolute maximum of 48 mortal wounds in a single turn. That's a lot. That is way too much damage that a lot of people cannot deal with. But the other major thing that we think about with this kind of list is it is difficult for opponents to remove all of our pieces. Removing 10 Khazarkin is not trivial in general. You have to remember that trying to remove a unit of Khazarkin is going to take somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 to 50 stubber shots that are hitting on 3s. And that's if the Khazarkin are in the open. If the Khazarkin are in cover, it very quickly gets up to about 60 stubber shots required to remove 10 dudes. And naturally, there are not a lot of things in the game that just have 60 extra stubber shots running around. So what you oftentimes will find is anything that wants to go in and kill 10 Kazurkin, especially if you can give them the take cover order for the +1 save, is usually going to cost more than the Kazurkin actually did themselves. Similar things are also true of a lot of other parts of this army. Removing 5 Krieg Engineers is easy, yes, but you do have to devote something to do it, because otherwise they're going to throw another grenade at you next turn. They're going to go stand in a place where you don't want models to stand next turn. So every single time one of these units is running around on one wound or with one model, it is a massive problem for our opponent to deal with. The other major thing is we have 3 big units in this army, especially with the double Dorn variants or the double Cadian Brick variants, where these are just difficult for opponent to remove in general. If you've never played against a Rogel Thorn, if you've never played against the 20 Cadians before, I would definitely recommend taking a game, or even just rolling some dice, trying to see what it takes to actually remove one of these units, and it is a lot. So one of the things that we're oftentimes trying to do with the rest of our army is we are trying to take all of this and using this to remove the threats to these pieces, because these pieces are almost always going to be active in the last couple of turns of the game, where they're basically invincible. The number of times where I've had a Rogel Thorn marching into my opponent's deployment zone on turns 4 or 5 is ridiculous. The number of times where I've had this unit walking onto my opponent's home objective is really, really high, because I'm going out of my way to make sure that I can remove the threats to all of these units that do a ton of damage and can stand on points really effectively later on in the game. So the one other thing that I want to make sure we get into before I go through a example deployment with this army and talk about what our major goals would be with this army is understanding the concept of different waves. So looking at the screen, going from top to the bottom is approximately the order in which we oftentimes play these waves. And you can think of each wave as when does it become really active on the board. Our first wave is made up of almost always all of our Krieg Engineers, but if you're choosing to run Attilan Rough Riders or Death Riders, they are almost always in the first wave as well. If you've seen my Lizard meme about Krieg Engineers, this is the perfect time for it. These units are not usually going to be doing a ton of damage, but they're going to be going out, standing on an objective, doing area denial, and recovering assets. If they get to throw out some of their mortal wounds, great, but they don't need to. It's something that we like to have them do, but it isn't always going to be necessary. These units are going to be part of the game immediately. They're going to be moving onto the board, they're going to be throwing bombs at the enemy, they're going to be scoring objectives, and they're going to be standing in front of our opponent in order to control where they can move. Another piece that is kind of in wave 1.5 is oftentimes a Chimera with Kazurkin inside. And I put these in wave 1.5 because they sometimes are part of wave 1, but they're sometimes part of wave 2. One of the really important things that we are trying to do with this army is recognizing that we have more things than our opponent does almost always. My version of the list has 15 unique activations in it, and there are variants that have an even higher activation count than this one does. The vast majority of armies do not have an activation count that high, and even those that do very rarely have an activation count of as high of a quality as the one that we are putting out. So if our opponent gives us some cultists to go run down with the Chimera, we can do it. If our opponent shows us some scout marines that we can go hunt down with the Chimera or the Kazurkin, we can do it. Sometimes in order to get the damage that we need, we will go ahead and take the Kazurkin out of the Chimera in order to get every single gun off. But sometimes we can keep the Kazurkin inside the Chimera in order to force our opponent to deal with the fact that they have to kill the transport and then kill the guys inside. So these are sometimes part of wave 1 where they go to kill our opponent's units immediately, but sometimes they're part of the second wave where they're needed to go respond to things that have come out to kill the engineers. In wave 2, we have sometimes this Kazurkin and Chimera, but we definitely have at least the second Kazurkin and Chimera, oftentimes another unit of Kazurkin that are either starting on foot or off the board, and the 10 Death Corps of Krieg, which have tried to go stand on our objective on turn 1. The things that our opponent has to commit in order to deal with the Krieg Engineers are almost always going to be problems that we can solve with 2 units of Kazurkin and a Chimera, or sometimes 3 units of Kazurkin and 2 Chimeras. While our first wave is going off to go do things and die, members of our second wave are oftentimes standing on our natural and moving into our primary staging positions on the board. Some units that are once again in wave 2.5 are Scions, who are oftentimes going to be dropping in order to deal with some of the heavier threats our opponent has put out, and the big Cadian Brick with Nork and the Cadian Castellan. If our opponent has big enough threats that we need to bring these units out, we will. But we are also very happy to leave them in a position where they are staged for the third wave. Again, the major thing that we're thinking about is while the first wave moves up, our second wave is going to stage in good positions. And then as our second wave moves up, our third wave is going to start staging in good positions as well. Remember, we can look to rapid ingress these signs in order to get angles that we couldn't have if they were just normally deep striking. Our third wave is almost always going to include our Rogel Thorns. We have hopefully been able to get them a little bit active, but typically we are using these Rogel Thorns during the first and second wave in order to get just like a bare minimum angle in order to shoot something that our opponent can't shoot our Dorns back. But by the time we're getting into our third wave, these Rogel Dorns are probably moving up to stand on primary by turn 3 or 4, and at this point are almost always going to be able to get within 18 inches of our opponent's major damage dealing threats like their tanks or things like Khorne Berserkers. The Scions, once again, if we haven't already put them into the second wave, they are going to be coming in with the third wave. And similarly, the Cadians, which maybe we're playing in the second wave, are definitely coming out to play with the third wave. Remember, by using our first and second waves to remove things that are threats to our Rogel Thorns, say anti-tank units that have come out to kill our Chimeras, we are trying to make the Rogel Thorns safer later on. Similarly, by using our Scions a little bit as bait, things that are capable of killing the Scions are very often going to be similar to the things that are going to be capable of killing 20 Cadians with the command squad. And by removing our threats to Scions, by removing our threats to our Khazarkan, we are also removing threats to the Cadians. Remember, damage in the game is highest on Battle Round 2, and then kind of trends down over the course of the game, to the point where having 20 bodies on turns 4 or 5 is almost unmanageable for a lot of armies. This is why I like having this Cadian unit just there, because it spent so much of the game screening, but that by the time we get to battle rounds 4 and 5, it can just move up. It doesn't have anything left that it needs to screen. It's going to be moving into the middle of the board in order to score me those late game cleanse, the late game primary, and the late game actions that we need to do. Now, I do want to reiterate once again that I've put a couple of things in waves 1.5 and 2.5, but even things that I've put in the second wave or the third wave don't have to be part of those waves. These are guidelines, they are not rules. If our opponent at the top of turn 1 sends their entire army to come fight us, well, things that are part of waves 2 and 3 need to come out and play. They need to start doing that damage immediately. If our opponent chooses to play a faster game than we were initially intended to, we have to be able to respond. The flip side is also true. If our opponent was not able to deal with our first wave, maybe their shooting just didn't work or they missed a couple of key charges, we don't have to send out our entire second wave. If we lost 2 units of Krieg Engineers, maybe we only need to replace them with Khazarkan and 10 Krieg, but we can hold the other Khazarkan and the other Chimera still staged in order to be ready to move out on the next turn. Thinking about the game in terms of waves is helpful, it's not a rule. The other major thing is sometimes we don't have 3 waves. If our opponent was overly aggressive, or if our opponent is giving us angles that they are probably not supposed to have, our second wave and our third wave can all go at the same time in order to punish them for being too aggressive. So with all that said and done, I want to take you through an example of a deployment that you might be looking to do with Doombolt Guard. Again, this is with the version that I've been playing, but this is not the only way and it's not the only variant to play this kind of army. For this example, we are going to be looking at Games Workshop Layout 6 with Tipping Point. Games Workshop Layout 6 is a relatively open board. There are some long shooting lanes across the center, across the sides of the board, and there's a very long diagonal from one corner to another. So, let's talk about this in terms of waves. Our first wave is naturally going to be our Krieg Engineers. We have 1 Krieg Engineers over here by this ruin. We have 1 set of Krieg Engineers here in the middle, and we have 1 set of Krieg Engineers over on the other side. They're going to be spread out like this so that I can play the entire board on turn 1 with pieces if I need to. Remember, these units scout 6, move 6, and can be ordered to move a total of 15 inches before they fire a shot. The general game plan with these is if we go first, they're going to scout directly at our opponent. Once here, they're typically going to go create screens and do whatever actions and or objectives I need to. If in so doing, I got to do a little bit of damage to my opponent's army, great, but it's not something that I am super focused on them doing. Next, looking at pieces that are going to be in the second wave. Firstly, having this Chimera here in the middle is why it's part of the wave 1.5. Sometimes it's part of wave 1, sometimes it's part of wave 2. Remember, this Chimera gets to scout 6 and then move 10 or move for move 13, meaning he can move 19 inches at the very beginning of the game. And to show you what 19 inches looks like, it can go all the way to here. on the very beginning of the game. This Chimera can make a lot of spots in our opponent's army uncomfortable because we can disembark guys into this ruin and shoot into this pocket. We're already catching a lot of area here where things like cultists and chaos spawn are maybe uncomfortable to stand, and similarly over here where if we were to disembark guys all the way out to this pink, we can catch basically everything that is going to be standing behind this ruin. If there is a part of our opponent's army that is crucial to the way that they play the game or is a threat to other parts of our army as well, this is a perfect spot in order to use the Chimera on wave 1 in order to go punch our opponent in the mouth. However, if there's nothing for this Chimera to do, this Chimera can plausibly stage in here for our opponent that has any shooting that we're worried about. It can plausibly stage right on the edge where it's going to be getting cover, but it requires our opponent to come answer. Or if our opponent has enough shooting, it can stage behind this ruin as well. On the right side, this Chimera's main job and the main reason why it's going to be coming over here is so that it can move into a spot where it can deal with things on our opponent's objective. If it moves, it doesn't quite make the objective here. But if you move, you will be able to come here and put a couple of guys on the objective in order to make sure that you can counteract your opponent's primary. If your opponent is closer than that, we can swing out a little bit further in order to make sure that we can shoot anything that is on that objective, unless it's very small. Other parts of Wave 1.5 R2 are these Kazarkin. Remember, this unit also scouts 6 and moves 6 or 9 inches. So 15 inches before you need to fire can put you in a lot of cool places on the board right away in order to come deal with our opponent. But this unit is also reasonably happy to stage in here if our opponent doesn't have shooting, or behind this ruin if it needs to. On the left-hand side, we have this Death Corps of Krieg, whose main job is they're going to be receiving move, and they're going to be moving 9 inches to come touch this objective on turn 1. We would love to be able to roll in advance and hide them more aggressively like here, or sometimes here, depending on what threats there are to this objective. And then after we've hopefully secured this objective for a turn, they're going to be moving out this way in order to create a new screen or potentially do a little bit of damage over on this side. For parts of our wave 3, we can start looking at these Rogel Dorns. One of the major things about layout 6, it is actually very difficult to deploy relatively safely. Barely leaving their deployment zone, it is very easy for our opponent to get these lines of sight. So everything that is touching this red is potentially a target for their shooting. So what I like to do with my Rogel Dorns is I like to deploy them in a pair down here relatively safe. And some people are already looking at this and they go, wait, you might have hid from the red lines, but you are not safe from the blue lines. And this is true. On layout 6, it is not really possible for you to deploy all of your army in a spot where it is going to be useful right away and also cannot get shot. One of the reasons why I like putting this Dorn here and not over here is anything that comes into these blue lines of sight are, one, they're going to be close enough that I can return fire very effectively. They're coming close to everything that is staged here, which will be able to react, and they're also moving to a spot where this Dorn can react. If they are going to be coming in over here, I can deal with those problems. Whereas if instead my Dorn is here in this red line of sight, my Rogel Dorn is in this red line of sight, they're too far. This is in a position where I can't necessarily fire back. I can't necessarily deal with these problems. And it means that I'm oftentimes going to be finding myself in a spot where I might end up losing a Rogel Dorn for free. If my opponent doesn't have any shooting, I will happily deploy a Dorn here. It is very important that you do not deploy this Dorn back here. It is simply too far, and while we want it to be part of Wave 2 or Wave 3, this Dorn does not have an option to participate in Wave 1 or 2. It's going to spend most of the time hanging out back here and then moving into a position where it can participate as Wave 3 as probably the earliest. Other piece of Wave 2 or Wave 3 is these Cadians. And these Cadians are typically going to be moving up to somewhere in here on the first turn. From here, they can fairly easily threaten to move, charge things on our opponent's natural, move, charge things in the middle, and sometimes move, and potentially charge things that are hiding over in this ruin here. Lastly, these Cadians that we have strung out in the back, they're mostly going to be sitting there screening for a lot of the early game, but will eventually move up to a similar position here, to move here, in order to reinforce whatever we need to on the board. Lastly, of course, things that are in reserves, 2 units of Kazarkin in transports, and 2 units of Scions that are in Deep Strike. They're going to be looking to respond to threats on the board as needed, but there are a couple places we are looking to put them intentionally. One of my favorites is you will oftentimes find people using their tanks to hide out here and draw very tight angles into this little square. What this oftentimes means is you can find spots to put these Scions relatively safely as a rapid ingress here, who can then move themselves to come over this way and destroy anything on the objective here. That's one of my favorite spots to rapid ingress. Another place that I really like dropping Scions is going to be in roughly this spot, where they will be able to shoot anything on this objective, but they're kind of hard to shoot back, especially if we're being intentional with our positioning and just trying to draw up minimum lines in order to shoot things on this part of the objective, but we're not visible from this part of the objective over here. Of course, being deep striking infantry means that we can be relatively opportunistic in the places that we are going to be looking to go, but those are a couple of my favorites that you're going to be looking for. And let's talk about some big mistakes I oftentimes see in deployment and why I generally consider them mistakes. One of the more common mistakes that I end up seeing on this board is deploying tanks in this spot here. And this spot is fine for the tank, but the reason why I don't like this spot is we've already kind of shown you that there's not a ton of what I call premium deployment space, places where you can go and definitely not get shot. By putting a tank here, it means we have to move our other pieces backwards. Something like the Nordkasten brick, who typically take up this spot, are going to have to move a little bit further back to here, and then when you roll in advance or move, you don't always successfully get to this position on turn 1. Another small mistake that I see fairly often is deploying things like Krieg Engineers back here. And this is a small mistake, but it does end up costing you a decent amount. Note that these Krieg Engineers are realistically getting about 2 inches just from deploying in front. And while that doesn't sound like a big deal, can be the difference between a 7-inch charge and a 9-inch charge later. If you were to deploy in these different locations, and they were trying to charge a Rhino immediately afterwards, this unit is looking for a 9-inch charge. This one's looking for a 7. The red one is within grenade range. This one is not. So when you're going for this deployment, you want to make sure that the Krieg Engineers are as far forward as they're allowed to be, with the ability to scout backwards if you end up going second. What this often means is you're going to interlace these 2 units, because it is still important that this unit back here can touch this objective with a 9-inch move. But this guy here doesn't quite make it. He's going to need to roll in advance. So you don't want to have the entire first row and the second row. Before I let you guys go, I just want to give you guys a little bit of an overview on why I call this the strongest singles list that you can play if you're not willing to play recon. And the big thing about this is this game plan is so strong that there are very few enemy armies that can actually deal with it. And the ones that can are not very common right now. This archetype is super good into Knights. It has so much OC that it can deal with Necrons very effectively. It has a good matchup into almost every Marine variant out there, except for some more shooting-heavy Ultramarines lists. It doesn't really have strong opinions on what board it's playing on. It can play fairly dense boards pretty well. It can play very open boards pretty well. There's almost no army in the game that I think this has a losing matchup into. Whereas if you were to play 2 Dorns and 3 Vanquishers, or 2 Dorns and 12 Bulgrin, those are still very strong guard lists, and they will absolutely destroy certain archetypes in the game in ways that Doombolt can't. However, they don't have as wide of a breadth of tools, and they are still going to struggle into things that it can't deal with. The Bulgrin are a bit too slow, and they're going to get ripped apart by something like Genestealer cults because they don't have the volume necessary. 3 Vanquishers are going to destroy any kind of Knights that you're playing up against, but the cost is they, again, might not have the volume to deal with something like Green Tide. Doombolt has plenty of volume. We have plenty of mortal wounds. There's plenty of tools because there are just so many things in the army that you can put in different places on the board whenever you need to. So with that said, I hope this has been helpful, and hopefully if you have questions about what Doombolt Guard is, or some of your friends have issues or questions about how to play this, send them to this video. If you're looking for more in-depth coaching and all that kind of stuff, make sure you hit me up on Discord. Until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.